Connecting to cloud server. Okay, cool. So I think that we're recording now. Alrighty. So before the class, Guru, do you want to give some updates?
You can go ahead and start the
Yeah.
stream.
Did Guru hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I don't have much of an update. I think is today I'm supposed to talk about Gopal Bhatta or Goswami? Is this just appearance day or appearance day?
Appearance day.
It's appearance.
So,
Just
Bhagavad Motava, Gopal Bhatta Goswami, Vijay.
Jai.
Let me just talk about the subject. It's an interesting subject, of course, and we'll see if there's time for questions afterwards. But we find very little information about Gopal Bhatta Goswami and Chaitanya Charitamrita, and that's significant in that it's thought that he gave his blessings to Krishnadas Kaviraj in terms of writing the book, as others did, but he gave his with a caveat that he would bless the effort if he wasn't mentioned in the book. So the idea there, of course, is that he was very humble, and as a result, I think his name is mentioned once, but there's no information about it. Of course, information is available from other sources, and he happens to have a very colorful kind of Gaudiya history, as Sanatan Goswami and Raghunath Das Goswami do. And so there's a fair amount that could be said about him. But it's interesting to note his humility, given his pedigree at the same time. That means to say that he hailed from a very prestigious South Indian Brahmin family, which would have been very prestigious, I should say, in the Hindu social religious community at the time, compared to, for example, Rupa and Sanatan, who had been more or less ostracized from the community, having been engaged in the service of the Muslim government and so forth. And Jiva, their nephew, by extension, was also implicated in that. And Das Goswami, Raghunath Das Goswami, was from a Kayasta family, not a Brahmin family. We do find Raghunath Bhatta Goswami from a Brahmin family in the north. But some things are written about him by Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami. His story is not as colorful, I would say, as Gopal Bhatta Goswami's. But at any rate, the Goswami Gopal Bhatta hailed from a very prestigious background, and he would have been looked at by the social religious community as a very high class person, as a person who was in a position to convey spiritual knowledge, be a guru, give diksha, and in ways that the other Goswamis were not to the same extent, I guess you could say, in the case of Raghunath Bhatta Goswami. And so it's interesting to see that contrast between his humility and the prestigious position that he held, relatively speaking, again, in the eyes of the social religious Hindu community of the time. And it should be pointed out, I think, that because of his social position, he was pushed into the forefront amongst the founding acharyas in terms of giving diksha, giving initiation. So obviously any of them were more than qualified, but for relative considerations in terms of the climate, the social and religious climate of the time, strategically speaking, I suppose you could say, in the context of forming a sampradaya, which is no easy task, Gopal Bhatta Goswami was in a better position to take that role. So he became the principal initiator. We know that at most, Rupa Goswami's disciple was only one, in that case of his nephew, Jiva Goswami. We don't have any record of Sanatana Goswami initiating and so forth. Although it appears that Raghunath Das Goswami did, Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami identifies himself as his disciple. Nonetheless, over and above some exceptions or minor differences, Gopal Bhatta Goswami, for, I would say, reasons of his pedigree, as that was perceived by the community at large at that time, put him in a better position from a strategical point of view to be the official initiator. It was less risky of a position going forward to take in terms of what objections might arise to the sampradaya. So a preaching strategy, it would seem. And of course, there's a beautiful anecdote as to Mahaprabhu's, I would say, confirmation of that strategy, whether it was, I don't think it was mandated by him, but I think he implied through anecdote that I will relate going forward, that was a wise position, that he supported that position, a position I think that was taken in Vrindavan by Rupa and Sanatana Goswamis, who were the leaders of the 6 Goswamis, who really are the founding acharyas of the sampradaya. So the story goes, of course, that the history goes that Gopal Bhatta Goswami hailed from South India, and he was the son of Venkata Bhatta and his wife, who were in a very prestigious position in the Ramanuja Sampradaya. I think that they were, Gopal Bhatta, Venkata Bhatta was akin to the head priest in Srirangam, the capital of the Ramanuja Sampradaya, very prestigious, well-established for quite some time Vaishnav Sampradaya. Mahaprabhu visited there, of course, traveling in South India as he did after coming to Puri. Shortly thereafter, he went on a kind of a preaching outing, if you will, to South India. And for 4 months during the rainy season on that 2-year tour, he spent, he stayed was hosted, I should say, by Venkata Bhatta, who must have been very impressed by the young Sri Krishna Chaitanya, who had only recently taken sannyas at the age of 24. And there's some beautiful anecdotes that arise out of that period, related in Chaitanya Charitamrita and other texts. And I'll come to those with going forward from that. The visit of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to Srirangam and the hosting of Venkata Bhatta and so forth has been commemorated by the Sampradaya, Ramanuja Sampradaya itself. So besides evidence from the Gaudiya Sampradaya of this relationship, it would seem that the Ramanuja Sampradaya recorded it or recognized it as well, and they evidence of that is, of course, that something was done to remember that event. I believe, I haven't been there myself. I've been so fortunate, but I believe there is a deity of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, like standing at the Garuda Stamba as he would in Jagannath Puri, having a darshan of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to commemorate his visit there, his stay there. There's an interesting relationship that comes to mind. Having said that, when we think of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Jagannath Puri, and the fact that Ramanuja had been commissioned by Vishnu to travel throughout India, Ramanujacharya, and update, improve, systematize to some extent the Vaishnav rituals and procedures involved in Archan at various Vaishnav centers and temples throughout India. But when he came to Jagannath Puri, the story goes that there are a lot of irregularities, if you will, in the worship there, and seeking to update them with a Vaidhi Marg conception of Vaishnavism that, of course, Ramanuja was steeped in. He woke up in the morning and found himself at a distant place. Somehow or other, the Jagannath had thrown him out of Jagannath Puri and said, you know, how it's going on here, we're going to just leave it as it is. Of course, Jagannath is a very special deity for Gaudiya Sampradaya. And there's another instance in this regard of even one of Mahaprabhu's own associates seeking to none other than what is his name? Famous associate of Mahaprabhu, elderly.
Pundarik Vijayanidhi.
Yeah, Pundarik, thank you. Pundarik Vijayanidhi sought to change the standard in terms of something that he had observed, and he was awakened in the evening with having been beaten up in his dream by Jagannath and Baladev, who told him, you know, this remains as it is. So it's a special place. And of course, Mahaprabhu, looking at Jagannath Puri, saw him bearing a flute and looking at Jagannath, I should say, saw him bearing a flute and playing a flute and bearing a peacock feather, his eyes wide open, you could say, looking everywhere for the Radha that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was, whose shoes, whose bhava Mahaprabhu was trying to step into, and did so successfully in Jagannath Puri. So anyway, there's a murti, or a statue of him, as I understand it, at the Garuda Stamba, looking at Jagannath in the Sri Rangam courtyard or somewhere. They're commemorating his visit there. So it was profound, and had a profound effect on the parents of Gopal Bhatta Goswami, as well as upon his initiating guru, who was the brother of Venkatapata, Prabodhananda Saraswati. There's some controversy about Prabodhananda Saraswati, who he is, where he hails from, and so on and so forth. But I think that that story, or that question, historical question, is really resolved by the position taken by the Radharaman Temple, who are the followers, Diksha followers of Gopal Bhatta Goswami in particular, cared for his deity, Radharaman, wherein they accept that Gopal Bhatta Goswami was initiated by Prabodhananda Saraswati and acknowledge him as a Vaishnav from the south and the brother of Venkata and so on and so forth. So While there, at any rate, as I say, there are some very interesting, philosophically insightful anecdotes that brought about the conversion of Venkatabhatta and his wife, Prabodhananda Saraswati, and the young Gopal Bhatta was, of course, a witness to that, and as a result, a desire to become a follower of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Gaudiya Vaishnavism. But Sri Gopal was born probably in around 1500, or some say 1503, I believe, which would make him about 15, 17 so years older than Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Mahaprabhu was there as a 24 or 25-year-old young man, sannyasin, which would have put what Gopal Bhatta about, well, quite an adolescent, not an adolescent, but in his Pauganda, in boyhood. And so you can imagine how, with what wide eyes he observed the discourse and the reaction to that discourse that was initiated by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, who, in summary, asked the learned scholar Venkata why it was that Lakshmi, who is characterized as being supremely chaste to Narayan, desired to have a rendezvous with Krishna. Does that not bring her chastity into question? And Venkata answered nicely by saying that the two are one in tattva, Krishna and Narayan. So there is no question of any deviation on the part of Lakshmi with regard to her chastity. Of course, Mahaprabhu knew this, and his first question was really a stepping stone to his second question that really bewildered Venkatabhatta and caused his was critical, I should say, to bringing about his conversion. Mahaprabhu forwarded this question, and the second one, which I'll get to, with a kind of in jest. I mean, to say, how can Lakshmi be chaste if she's married to Narayan, but she's running off with Krishna, wants to run off with Krishna? It's kind of lighthearted in a sense, but Venkata, I think, took it seriously and gave a philosophical, theological answer. Vaishnava Siddhanta, again, the two are one, different expressions of the same person. But the kind of humor of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu leading to his second question is an example of how he brought about some very significant conversions. By joking, he converted Venkatabhatta. By silence, really, he converted or created a teachable moment in the life of Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, which resulted in his conversion. By his humility, he converted Prabodhananda Saraswati. He was light on preaching in comparison, we should say, to the weight of his example. So he mostly converted by his example. And through silence, through humility, through joking, he created these teachable moments. In these three instances, that were significant, constituted or amounted to significant conversions in the subcontinent, the landscape there. These were big people, and there were others as well. This is just an aside. Mahaprabhu's preaching was asked last week in this question and answer session last Sunday by a young man how to preach, and I emphasized the importance of doing so by one's example. And this was very much the case with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So with humor, he was cited a question and then given a good answer, to which he then replied, how is it then, why is it then, if Narayan and Krishna are one and there's no fault on the part of Lakshmi desiring to associate romantically with Krishna, why is it that she was unable to? The question, why is she not able to, which Venkata couldn't answer, that caused that was a conversion moment for him. He really came to the conclusion that only someone that could ask the question would know the answer. Mahaprabhu knew the answer because he came to give a method by which one could attain that status, to enter into Goloka, to participate in the romantic life of Krishna. And there's a specific method to that is not part of the method or the approach to transcendence found within Ramanuja Sampradaya. And this was central, of course, to the new and formative Sampradaya, still to be formed. At that date had not been formed. Mahaprabhu was now finding, in stopping there and staying there for 4 months, he's finding a very significant person in Gopal Bhatta Goswami, the future Gopal Bhatta Goswami, who will be the principal initiating guru of his Sampradaya, that whose Sampradaya, whose method, to its madness, of course, is a particular type of bhakti that we call raga bhakti. Lakshmi, of course, could not attain her desire to participate in the Rasa Leela with Krishna because she did not approach through Rag Bhakti, which was something that was counter to her very psychological, trans-emotional makeup, her sthai bhav, in which she's loves Narayan with an element of awe and reverence that is absent in the Rag Bhakti of Braj and amongst the gopis in particular. So there's a method, and Mahaprabhu came to give that method. So now he could come out with what that method was about to one extent or another, and as a result, bring about the conversion of Venkata Bhatta and his wife, and Prabodhananda Saraswati, the brother of Venkata Bhatta. And again, and you can just imagine, inspire the young Gopal Bhatta Goswami, whom he then, who wanted to follow Mahaprabhu. Mahaprabhu, I believe, pushed him towards Prabodhananda Saraswati for initiation, and told him to take care of his parents until the time presented itself that they had been sufficiently cared for, and then meet him in Vrindavan. So Mahaprabhu this is another significant reason for his tour of South India, to meet Ramananda Roy. That was obviously very significant. And bring him into the fold, send him to Jagannath Puri, where he would, in the end, the Antya Leela, play such a significant role in assisting Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to entering into the Bhav of Radha. And this is another significant event, to pick up Gopal Bhatta Goswami, send him to Vrindavan, where he would play such a significant role as the principal Diksha Guru of the Sampradaya. And he told Prabodhananda Saraswati that he would, meet him there again. At this point, of course, he had not yet sent Rup and Sanatan there, commissioned them, empowered them with a mission to establish the places of Leela in Vrindavan, to write books and set an example of Vaishnava achar, behavior, and so forth. But it, you could say it seems to have been in the within the omniscience of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Here he's picking out a significant player, sending him there, then he'll send Rup Sanatan. And so, of course, Gopal Bhatta arrived later because he was also asked to take care of his parents for some time. So Rup Sanatan already went to Vrindavan ahead of him and were waiting there, of course, for him to come. And upon his arrival there, of course, he was waiting for Mahaprabhu to come to have his darshan again, something that ostensibly did not occur, but occurred nonetheless indirectly by way of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu sending to Vrindavan for Gopal Bhatta his seat, wooden asan. Maybe that was from where, I'm not sure, but this, I think his shoes, a pair of his shoes, and perhaps chadar or piece of his dhoti. I have a piece of that, which is kept on the altar there at the Radharaman temple. So this was one aspect of Mahaprabhu's support, if you will, indirectly, if you look between the lines, so to speak, for the position of Gopal Bhatta. Mahaprabhu was the founder of his own sampradaya, and he's giving his seat to Gopal Bhatta Goswami in shoes. So it's some support for the idea that he should sit on the seat, be the Diksha Guru. And then, of course, Mahaprabhu is thought, by extension, you could say he came there through the paraphernalia that he sent, that he's non-different from. But even more so, of course, in the story of the manifesting of Radharaman, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu did fulfill his promise to Gopal Bhatta that I'll see you later, we'll meet again in Vrindavan. So we have to come to that significant event in the life of Gopal Bhatta Goswami, in the life of all of Vrindavan and all of Gaudiya Vaishnavas. I was thinking about this the other day in light of the fact that we would have this discussion, and in relation to other topics that have recently come up, in particular the discussion about Krishna and the Indian culture in which he appears, and to what extent it's sometimes asked, that has to be preserved, and isn't he universal? God could eat pizza, he doesn't have to eat pakoras, and so on and so forth. He doesn't have, how far to take that in one direction towards the present culture and universalize Krishna. That's a very, of course, interesting discussion. My own, just as an aside, I haven't brought that up, my own personal opinion is that the more that you universalize, the two aspects, as I said the other week when this question was brought up, there's the breadth of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's mission, and there's the depth of it. And the more you go towards the breadth, the more the particulars and specificity of Krishna and his Leela fade out of the picture. Religiously speaking, or in terms of spiritual conception, of course, the broadest conception of the absolute is undifferentiated Nirvisesh Brahman. This is also God. And many people like to think that cultural differences amongst different religious sects all are relative and disappear as one enters into the absolute, which is undifferentiated and not carrying with it any cultural baggage from the material world. So that's the most kind of universal conception. And then you have in Vaidhi Bhakti, you have, of course, Narayan. There's some specifics there, but he has unlimited appearances. His avatars are asankhya, uncountable. So unlimited faces makes him less specific. So you could argue for any particular face or no face. Sometimes the Christians say God has no face. Less specific. Narayan is less specific in this sense and other senses, which makes his worship less intimate and less a full expression of all we know to be love. For example, there's no friendly love with Narayan. There's no parental love with Narayan. There's no gopi bhav with Narayan, but this we find in Krishna. So the conception is becoming more specific, and the possibility of loving is becoming more coming more into the picture as well. So anyway, Krishna appears in the world, the Prakat Leela. Some may question what he's like, how he actually appeared. But I was thinking about that and kind of chuckled, thinking, well, Radharaman appeared in the world, that's for sure, out of an apricot, unmanifest position. He became manifest. Of course, I have to tell the story. And he's very specific how he looks. Even has teeth, Radharaman. Of course, I should go ahead and tell the story. And I believe that in a dream, Gopal Bhatta had visitation from Mahaprabhu, who told him to the Gandaki to go to Nepal, to the Gandaki, and so he went, and I think he made a couple of disciples there, brought back with him, and that place is famous for the Shalagram Shilas. And when he put his load into the Gandaki for bathing water, brought it out, there were, I think, 12 Shilas. So he thought, well, who am I to worship the Shilas? So he put them back in the water. He dipped the load again, and they came again. That's the story. So he was convinced by that they were meant to be taken with him. So he put them in a cloth and tied it in a knot, and returned to Vrindavan with the Shilas and proceeded to make their worship part of his daily sadhana, daily routine. And at some point, a fairly wealthy merchant and Vaishnav, expressing regard for Gopal Bhatta Goswami, gave him some paraphernalia for worshiping the Shilas that constituted a nice gift, but didn't work that well for a Shila to have a dress and all that would work better for a deity. By this time, Rup, Sanatan, they had their deities of Govindaji, Madan Mohan were being worshipped and so forth. And the Gopal Bhatta only had the Shilas that didn't lend themselves in the same way to decorating and dressing and so forth. But the merchant asked, please accept the offering nonetheless. And so he accepted the offering of the items. And then during the Nishinga Chaturdasi, the celebration day, commemoration of the Leela of Narasingha's self-manifesting out of a stone pillar, Gopal Bhatta Goswami was meditating on contemplating the measure of the devotion of Prahlad, that despite adversity, he remained faithful, committed, and absorbed in his deity, to the point that the deity appeared out of a stone pillar in a way that had never been seen before, and made a remedy to to the problems that he faced and more. And so with this in mind, it's very interesting that, of course, another role of Bhagavan Narasimha in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, this thought of Prahlad's character, Prahlad's devotion, overwhelming on that day of Nrsingadev's appearance, the mind of Gopal Bhatta gave rise to, of course, one of the Shilas manifesting out of the stone of the Shila manifesting as the deity of Radharaman. So the story goes, because when he woke up in the morning to take the deities to bathe in the Jamuna, he found that only 11 Shilas and a deity, maybe about so high, of who became known as the famous Radharaman. I think that the part of the Shila is on his hip and maybe part on the shoulder that he manifested out of. And he's a very beautiful, exotic deity. It's said that, of course, that amongst the three principal deities of Vrindavan, Madan Mohan, Govindaji, and Gopinath, who represent Sambandha, Abhideya, and Prayojana, it's thought that the grandfather of Krishna, Bhadranath, who had personal experience of Krishna, was later, after the disappearance of Krishna, asked by the priests who were having deities of Krishna made to weigh in on how well the craftsman had been able to capture what Krishna, looked like in stone. And he replied that the Madan Mohan was perfect up to the waist, and so another deity was crafted, and that's Govindaji. And then he replied, oh, perfect up to the neck, so the torso was perfect. And then Gopinath was carved, and he said, oh, and his head, smiling face is perfect. So he put the three together. Sambandha is the legs that we stand on, the foundational conceptual orientation. What is what is Gaudiya Vaishnavism? Who is God? Who are Shaktis? How they relate, and so on and so forth. The torso represents, of course, the arms of execution, which is bhakti itself, and the smiling face, the prayoja, the goal. These are the three principal deities of Vrindavan, acknowledged by Krishna's Kaviraj in Chaitanya Charitamrita. But then there's Radharaman, who came afterwards, and he said to embody the legs of Madan Mohan, the torso and arms of the midsection of Gopinath, Govindaji, and the smiling face of Gopinath, all in one, very special deity, and self-manifest. You can imagine what a event that was for everyone in Vrindavan, and of course, it drew patronage from wealthy royalty who built the famous temple of Radharaman. And amongst all of the deities that I've mentioned, the kind of original deities of the Gaudiya became deities of the Gaudiya Sampradaya. Madan Mohan and others were crafted before Sanatan and Rupa Goswami came to Vrindavan. But at any rate, these principal deities, all due to Muslim invasion, which involved desecrating temples, and deities were moved out of Vrindavan. Somehow, I forget the story, but somehow Radharaman remained safe. Of course, he's quite a bit smaller, so it'd be easy to conceal him, and has never left Vrindavan. His worship by the Radharaman Goswami families, Brahmin families, of course, is famous in Vrindavan. Prabhupada at one point advised us to seek out the Brahmins of pujaris, families who worship Radharaman. They do it, different families worship for a month, then another, something like that. They rotate forever. Seek them out for advice on deity worship. Something that, Prabhupada started and wanted it to develop to a higher degree of devotion, of archan as it is prescribed in the sacred texts. So they're quite famous there for their deity worship. There's been a ritual fire that I think was started with the opening of the temple that's been burning for over 450 years. It's always burning there. So a very high standard of worship and a very extraordinary deity. And the deity is given the name Radharaman. And one of the reasons is because he's thought to be both Radha and Raman together, which is, of course, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So Chaitanya Mahaprabhu appeared and again gave darshan to Gopal Bhatta, as he said he would in Vrindavan, in the form of Radharaman. There is maybe a silver crown, gold plate kept next to Radharaman for Radha, but she didn't appear along with him. But we know she's there, so to speak. They didn't take another deity and put her there. But in the form of Radharaman, at any rate, it's thought that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu again appeared and gave it to Gopal Bhatta and gave him his darshan, as he said he would. And again, he's a very, very special deity. Again, he has teeth. Never seen a deity with teeth. If you look real closely at some of the photos that have been taken, you can see his teeth. So a self-manifest deity. So from the aprakat, he manifests in the prakat. So the prakat lila is a little difficult to deal with, given our cultural times and our present way in modern society of determining history and time, so on and so forth. But here's an example from the unmanifest. He became manifest, and he has a beautiful Tribhanga Lalitam, very beautiful, charming, threefold bending form, and smiling, smiling for any number of reasons. Very pleased to make his appearance and to be cared for by his devotees. So it's very hard to overemphasize the importance of this and significance of Radharaman and the Radharaman temple. It happens to be, incidentally, one Gaudiya institution in Vrindavan that gave a favorable reception to the great Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur when he appeared there in an unorthodox appearance, so to speak, with a couple of disciples dressed like Catholic priests with black and white collars and shaved heads and tilak, which was one of his ideas of how to dress as missionaries and send them to the West for preaching. So he was dynamic in that sense of cultural considerations for preaching and outreach, while he was very, of course, centered deeply in the what is the Prayojan Tattva at the same time of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. I bring this up because many people in Vrindavan, sadhus and so forth, as they were thought to be, could not accommodate the dynamism of Bhaktisiddhanta and thought him to be some type of renegade. They even stoned members of his Parakram party. But the Radharaman Goswamis, they were more accommodating and generous and so forth. So that said, Gopal Bhatta Goswami also contributed significantly to the Sampradaya through literary works. In fact, the most important text from a point of view of tattva, in the Gaudiya Sampradaya is the work of Jiva Goswami Satsandarbha. It's 6 treatises. Each has their own name, but collectively it's referred to as Satsandarbha. And a Sandarbha is like in this case, like a necklace of jewels from the Bhagavatam that have been sewn together to present what is the tattva, the Siddhanta, the spiritual conclusions of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And this extraordinary work, celebrated work of Jiva Goswami, the Goswami Sri Jiva himself, in his own humility, attributes largely to Gopal Bhatta Goswami. So the contribution of Gopal Bhatta Goswami in terms of tattva, Siddhanta, by way of sahitya, or by way of literature, I should say, is significant. Jiva Goswami, in each of the Sandarbhas, at the onset of them, of course, offers respect to Rupa Sanatan, famous in Vrindavan, in Mathura district, as devotees, which says much about them. To be a devotee in Vrindavan is one thing; to be famous as a devotee there is another. And then to Gopal Bhatta Goswami, whose notes Jiva Goswami drew upon to ultimately write Satsandarbha. So he's basically saying, I'm only commenting on the notes. Actually, the hard work was done by Gopal Bhatta Goswami, who collected the information, and I simply put it together. It's probably some humility on his part, but at the same time, it shouldn't be doubted that Gopal Bhatta Goswami played a significant role in the production of Satsandarbha. So there's a very important role in terms of presenting the Gaudiya Tattva on his part. And then in terms of bhava, he also played a significant role through his literary contribution in the form of a commentary on Krishna Karnamrita. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, went to South India and he brought back 2 books. One was the Brahma Samhita, which he said was perfect, gave the perfect Siddhanta of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, Govindamadi Purusham Tamaham Bhajami. It's a book that puts in a broad sense, helps us to understand the position of different gods and goddesses in relation to Krishna, who's the original person, the Adi Purusham, the Swayam Bhagavan. This is, of course, the most important point of Gaudiya Tattva. Jiva Goswami calls it the Vastu. What did he say? Vastu. So Paribhas Sutra, the Paribhas Sutra, right, of the tattva of the Bhagavatam. So kind of like the password to the entering into what it's all about. And then from the point of bhava, he brought back another book called Krishna Karnamrita, Bilvamangal Thakur's work, where Radha Dasyam is showcased. It's a very, very poetic, esoteric book of Bhakti Rasa. And Gopal Bhatta Goswami wrote a commentary on that. Amongst the founding acharyas, the only one to have done so. So these are the 2 books that Mahaprabhu brought back that in a broad sense represented the tattva of Gaudiya Vaishnavism and the bhava in the fullest sense, the highest reach of what could be found in his sampradaya. So Gopal Bhatta, from a literary point of view, contributed to both of these, developing both of these aspects, the tattva, in terms of tattva satsandarbha, and the bhava, in terms of his commentary on Krishna Karnamrita. So in terms of worship, in terms of tattva, in terms of bhav, by way of literature, he's contributed. And also significantly in terms of, when we go back to somewhat the deity worship, ritual and the overall behavioral standards, procedures of to be embraced by members of the Sampradaya. So the book Hari Bhakti Vilas, which was written by Sanatana Goswami, is Gopal Bhatta Goswami had very much to do with himself. And he must have collected many, many of the verses that Sanatana Goswami cites in Hari Bhakti Vilas to support his points, where this is a book that's kind of Gaudiya Vaishnava, how to marry, you know, maybe what is the nature, how to give diksha, initiation, various mantras are found there, and all types of procedures and whatnot. So from that side, he's also contributed significantly. We find that the Goswamis in their books have contributed, Jiva Goswami in terms of tattva, principally, Sanatana Goswami in terms of sambandha, Rupa Goswami in terms of abhideya, Raghunath Das, aprayojan. And when in one sense, as we're saying, Gopal Bhatta contributed to all of these together, as his deity. Radharaman fully represents all three aspects of sambandha, abhideya, prayojan. So these are a few words, a few thoughts come to mind about Gopal Bhatta Goswami. Shri Gopal Bhatta Goswami ki jai. Gopal Bhatta Goswami Avirbhav Mahamutsavatīti ki jai. So that I'll conclude. Are there any questions, comments that arise from our discussion? This is the time to share them.
If you have a question, you can just unmute.
There was a question in Spanish in the chat earlier.
Well, Maharaj, I will take the opportunity to ask you a question, if I may.
I see Ananta Govinda has posted a link to a picture of Radharaman, and he says, and you can actually see his teeth. So everyone should take the opportunity to click on that link and have the darshan for that photo close up of Radharaman. Okay, well, I'm glad to have met with you all briefly here today on an auspicious day, and hope to be with you again.
Someone's asking a question.
Yeah, could you hear that, Gurudev? Someone wanted to ask a question. Did you hear them ask?
No, I didn't hear any question.
Okay,
Yes,
wait, I could hear it.
I think you can hear me now, Maharaj.
Yes, I can.
Yeah, I wasn't on the English language channel. Maybe this is a very base question, and I understand these meetings to be like meetings of esoteric Vaishnava discussions. But all these wonderful stories of, medieval Bengal and all the spiritual life which was going on there, I'm simply curious as to how much we know of the Gaudiya Vaishnavas in literature that is perhaps written from outside of the Gaudiya tradition. If these Goswamis and of course Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is written about by others, contemporaries.
Rather than by Gaudiya Vaishnavas themselves writing
Yes.
about Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Well, that's an interesting question, and there is during the time of the Bhadralok, the Hindu middle class of Calcutta, of Bengal, really, that was interacting with the British who made their capital in India, in Calcutta, and by interacting with the British ideas, Western philosophers, and so forth, and they were in the midst of an identity kind of a crisis. Who are we? What we believed? How much does it hold in relation to other thoughts that we weren't aware of? There's a whole Christian religion didn't know about. Now they're saying it's the only religion. So they had to reason about their faith, and it was an interesting period that Bhaktivinoda Thakur, of course, was a prominent player within, and the one amongst them, most significant one amongst them, who came out with a very strong position on Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Gaudiya Vaishnavism and its contribution, despite the fact that Gaudiya Vaishnavism itself, or adherence to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, or acceptance of Mahaprabhu, which was something that many people did and many groups formed around, many of which were not necessarily what we would call orthodox Gaudiya Vaishnav positions, but they nonetheless identified with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and his dispensation in one way or another. That was quite widespread, given his influence. Bhaktivinoda was involved in kind of trying to sort out what he considered was more the Brahminical perspective that the Goswamis wrote about on Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, that has come to be the orthodox Gaudiya Vaishnav position in the world. So during that period, not only were there persons like Bhaktivinoda who, from a religious and spiritual perspective, were involved in re-examining the teachings of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and distinguishing them from things that didn't really represent what, let's say, the Goswamis or Krishna's Kaviraj's perspective on Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was. Besides them, Bhaktivinoda and others, there were other people, secular people, who were also involved. This is what your question is about, in striving to form a national identity in this time of identity crisis. Here we are, we're Bengalis within India, and then there's the British here. There's this whole other world outside, and they're saying it's like this, we say it's like that. Other people in India say it's like, who are we? So the Bengalis were faced with a real kind of identity crisis. And so from a secular point of view, from a religious point of view, persons like Bhaktivinoda centered on Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. This is our culture. This is who we are. How can we move away from this? When he wore dhoti, like us, when he ate rice and like we did, and at least this is God. He came as one of us. And how can we move away from him? We should move towards him. And this should be representative of who we are as Bengalis. What is our culture, and so forth. So this is being done from a religious point of view, when people were moving away from their culture and maybe being overly influenced by modernity and the Western perspective and so forth. But there were secular people also, from a secular perspective, who were seeking to posit the idea that Bengal had its own identity. I mean, it was rich. And so from looking at the language, they uncovered texts, some of them during the Vaishnav kind of prominent period and so forth, and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and things about him and so forth. and they celebrated those things as being evidence that Bengal had a rich, historically speaking, rich culture of its own. And Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was such a fine example of that. So they identified with that, and they developed that in a way of, again, even just from a secular point of view, saying we Bengalis we're our own self, we're our own entity here. We should be proud of it. And who could be a better example of what it means to be a distinguished, cultured, significant Bengali than Chaitanya? So he became a national. He was thought of by them as those reformers as a national hero, just from a secular point of view, regardless of his, the teachings that surround his advent and the whole religious perspective and so forth. So I guess my answer is yes, that there are now what was written, what those texts were and so forth, that they celebrated, and they would have extended to some earlier texts in Bengal, of Chandidas, and who wrote poetically about Radha and Krishna Lila, just looking at it from a poetic point of view. Or then you go to the works of Kalidas and so forth, Meghadoot, and what they looked at these things, which were some of which were prior to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, but nonetheless Chaitanya Mahaprabhu leaned upon and drew from, to bring out his conception that was then turned into a systematic approach to entering into all that those literatures implied possibility of rasa and transcendence and so forth. So yeah, I mean, there were secular people also championing the contribution of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as a social reformer, and as part of a great literary history of Bengal. Hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you for the answer.
Okay. Anything else? All right, well, that took us a little over time anyway, so I think you're all satisfied, I hope, with the talk, and can think about it further, and we hopefully can meet again next week. Gopal, Bhatta, Goswami.
Thank you, Jai. Thank you for this really sweet class. It's really nice. Thank you. Okay. Haribol.
Thank you for that picture, Aradhana.